The following podcast contains accounts of child sexual assault. Listener discretion is advised.
Is there any reason why you did it?
Why I killed David Owen? I was like, I don't know. Not really, no. I mean, I was angry that day, but no particular reason, no.
Several weeks ago, we published an episode about the 1998 murder of former Wollongong Mayor Frank Arkell. At the time of his death, the man once known as Mr. Wollongong stood accused of being a member of a pedophile ring. He was awaiting a court date when he was brutally murdered by 19-year-old Mark Valera. It was Valera's second murder in as many weeks. He confessed to the murders, but he still fronted a judge 2 years later, where his defence team offered what they claimed were mitigating circumstances that should be taken into account during sentencing. Valera, they claimed, had been subjected to many years of sexual abuse at the hands of his father, Jack van Krevel. This accusation set in motion an equally brutal second act. Author John Suter Linton investigated the story and wrote a book about it called Bound by Blood. He joins us on Australian True Crime to talk about it. This is Australian True Crime. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast is created, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation.
Well, with all my books, I have a purpose to do them. I don't do them just for the sake of the story or to just give people some bloodlust. There's always an issue with the books I write in the sense that allegations are made, stories are told, events happen that become misconstrued, exaggerated. And so what I try and do is I try and clear the murkiness of it all and try and get to what actually is the truth as much as I can. And to find out what really happened in ways, what were the motives behind trying to say something different, or why was this being said? Why was this being thought of? So with the Valera story, there was a big issue, big contentious thing about the fact, was there a pedophile ring? Was Valera really the victim in this? Was he trying to avenge what had happened to him, his sister? And so I was just trying to find out what exactly was the truth.
Because at least one of the families of his victims, the O'Hearn family, suffered terribly, didn't they, from the insinuations that were made in the media, because Frank Arkell, the former politician, had been named in a royal commission to do with a pedophile ring.
For more than 3 decades, Frank Arkell was one of Wollongong's most prominent civic leaders, serving concurrent terms as the city's Lord Mayor and its state Member of Parliament. But it was after he lost his seat in 1991 that allegations of pedophilia surfaced. 3 witnesses at the Royal Commission claimed to have had sex with Mr Arkell when they were aged between 13 and 15. But the former MP denied the pedophilia allegations.
It's a terrible thing, we call that. It's the worst thing in the world. Worse than leprosy, I'm sure.
So when it became clear that the same offender had murdered him and murdered shopkeeper David O'Hearn, who also happened to be gay, there were a lot of assumptions about David O'Hearn being involved in a pedophile ring, and worse than assumptions, there were news stories.
That's right. I mean, the whole story was that basically people believed that O'Hearn and Arkell knew each other and that they were all part of this massive pedophile ring that was allegedly going on in Wollongong at the time. And it was, for the O'Hearn family, it was incredibly, I can't even think of the words to describe it. It was just horrendous.
No, distressing seems like an understatement.
It was. In fact, and I mean, David O'Hearn had been living in Tasmania for years, decades, owned a kind of light electrical store there, selling goods and services to people, was doing fairly well. Decided to move back because his mother was ill. He was from Wollongong originally. Decided to move back, and he had brothers and sisters here. So he came back to Wollongong, was only back for like probably months, like 2-3 months as far as I can remember. And in that time, he was murdered by Mark Valera. He just happened to live around the corner. And in Valera's own words, to paraphrase, he had seen O'Hearn on occasions and then decided one day just to, seeing O'Hearn arrive home, walked down the driveway, knocked on the front door and basically gave a sob story about needing some help, and O'Hearn invited him in, and while O'Hearn was attempting to make him a cup of tea, his life ended.
That's the mark of O'Hearn, isn't it? That he is a stranger knocks on his door, a young man knocks on his door and says to him, I need somewhere to stay. Do you have any room? Which is bizarre. And most of us would think that's weird and want them to leave straight away. He did not do that. He invited this young man in. He said, I don't have room, but maybe I can find room. He's, offering to call shelters in the neighbourhood and stuff. I mean, that's the mark of who this guy was.
That's correct. And his family obviously, thought David was wonderful and a lovely person and everything else. As a shopkeeper, he was always very welcoming. He had hospitality running through his veins. He was just a very nice, very helpful person. And there's been no evidence at all to show any connection, any likelihood that O'Hearn and Arkell knew each other. Not that would have meant that O'Hearn was part of any pedophile ring either. Guilt by association doesn't say, isn't the way to go. But irrespective, Valera as well did the same thing with Frank Arkell. Phoned him up, gave a sob story about being a lonely gay guy in Wollongong, wanting to know how to, cope with things, blend into society. And Arkell, likewise to O'Hearn, agreed to meet him and to discuss his problems.
Because Arkell had finally been outed as gay along with everything else.
Indeed,
right? So, yeah. It seemed plausible, I guess. But the other thing was that the nature of the crime, the nature of the murder of O'Hearn was so brutal, and it seemed to police and to the public, to anyone who started to hear whispers about what had happened in that house, it seemed like a crime of anger, fury, revenge, didn't it? It seemed impossible that a stranger could have committed this brutal attack on O'Hearn. We're talking about unbelievable violence.
Correct. It was mutilation, really.
It was a scene that I'd never encountered in all my years in the police. There was a body of a male laying on his back. He'd been decapitated. There was a hand sitting on a lounge, and it appeared that he'd been completely disemboweled, and the intestines and that were laying on a silver tray that was alongside the body.
On one of the walls there was a pentagram with the word Satan beside it. Another wall had an inverted cross. And on a mirror above a side table, the word Satan had been written also.
But it was also just a crime of sadistic pleasure. Mark Valera had an incredible interest, fascination, obsession, to call it, with serial killers, and had a book, which was very poorly written, I might add, about American serial killers, listing them, going into brief detail about who they were, their crimes. And so it was totally written for reasons of gratification. The book dealt with all these serial killers from America. And in that book, Valera had actually made lists of people, identities within Wollongong, people he knew, at the back and through the book as to presumably who he would eventually go out and murder. And that was his quest. That was what he wanted to do. Frank Arkell was high profile. He was out there. Yes, he was outed. Yes, he was being investigated for underage sex rather than the pedophile thing, because there is a difference with the age. You have to be clear about that legally. He was being looked at for underage sex. But of course, we don't know what the end result would be. He died before any trial could happen.
Early this morning, police were called to a home in North Wollongong by an elderly friend of Frank Arkell. Inside a flat at the back of the house, they found the badly beaten body of the 67-year-old man.
He was found in casual clothing and suffering apparently from head injuries, possibly from a blunt object.
The attack comes just weeks after the decapitation murder of another Wollongong man, rumoured to be associated with a satanic cult. Police would not rule out a connection.
It's fascinating the way the police finally got around to Valera, isn't it? That they, I guess, heard on the grapevine, because they started saying that they thought there was some kind of satanic motivation in the murders, specifically Ahern's murder, because there were pentagrams drawn on the wall in his blood and all these sorts of things. And someone came forward and said, oh, I know a young bloke who's into Satanism in the neighbourhood, and that is Keith Shriber. So they go around to visit Shriber. He's not home, but his housemate, Mark, is home. So Mark Valera. So the police come to the door, but he's very cool, isn't he? And because they come to the door looking for his flatmate, so he invites them in and shows them around.
Yeah, he's your typical sadistic killer, really. I mean, he can switch on and switch off very easily in the sense that if he could be murdering someone out the backyard, and then if the door rings, he comes and, brings people in and offers them a cup of tea without any sense of what's going on.
No panic.
No panic. Total control, not a problem at all. Knows exactly what he's doing, very much in the moment and fully aware of everything that's going on. But it was interesting because Shriber was known to police. He'd been picked up for petty offences through his time, so he was known to them. But Valera wasn't. He was a total unknown. What had happened was that police had identified Valera as a suspect, but they needed evidence. Now, the only piece that they were kind of missing was physical evidence, which in this case was a fingerprint, which they found at the scene. And because Valera was unknown to them, they didn't have his prints, but they eventually were able to find some pieces that he'd handled and were able to get prints off that and then identified him as their suspect. He was staying at a kind of like a halfway house, I suppose you'd call it, in Wollongong. Police went there to find out what his movements were, what time he's normally expected back, when he leaves, that type of thing, because they wanted to know what his routine was to eventually go and arrest him. The manager of the hostel kind of picked up on what was going on, although police didn't exactly tell him, but did ask him not to say anything to Valera. Whether he did or didn't is unknown, but that evening, Valera decided to go back to his karate coach, who he admired and really was probably about the only person that had some positive influence on Valera in his life at that time, and spoke to him, and then he convinced Valera that probably he should go and talk to the police about what he'd done. So he did. He turned up at Wollongong Police Station, much to the surprise of all the police. Homicide then came down from Sydney, Russell Oxford, Joe Casa, and interviewed him. Russell Oxford was the primary. Mark admitted to everything, again, very calmly, very straightforward, no hesitation, no sense of trying to hide what he'd done, which is pretty bizarre.
Is there any reason why you did it?
Why I killed David Ahern? I was like, I don't know, not really, no. I mean, I was angry that day, but no particular reason, no.
Okay, now did you know Frank Arkell prior to this?
I knew of him.
What did you know of him?
I knew that he was a convicted pedophile.
And what made you decide to go to his house that afternoon?
I had in my mind that I wanted to kill him because didn't like him.
No coating it in any way just to try and justify it.
Or to try and get himself out of any trouble at all.
Exactly. He was just straightforward, gave whole details, as gruesome as they were.
He takes police through walkthroughs of the crime scenes and very matter-of-fact explains how he did what he did.
Found there was a hacksaw up here with a hammer and the knives were just in the drawers here. And I got a sharp knife and cut through his stomach. And like cut through his stomach and I cut his head off. I cut his hand off.
And we always hear that, it's unlikely that an offender will commit such a brutal crime as their first crime. It's almost like that's an assumption we make that, you don't do that first off, you work up to that. But it seems as though Valera did commit this brutal murder as his first murder, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. I'm not a forensic psychologist, but I talk generally. In a lot of cases with people who kill, yes, it's true, they may not be as brutal or as, put it this way, it's very sad to say, but a lot of time was spent with David. It wasn't like 10 minutes and then rush out the door and get away quickly. A lot of time, sadly, Valera spent, in a sense, torturing David. And, yeah, that's not something that you would expect from a first-time offender.
And then mutilating the body. So absolutely not shocked or afraid of being caught after Ahern was dead. He stayed in the house and mutilated the body for a long time.
What you do find, and I don't know whether any history has really been revealed about Valera, but what you do find is there's a lot of animal torture happens in early age, and that helps you get beyond the being shocked by what you're doing, because it's just, you become very used to it, desensitized to that type of thing. But also you can sometimes be a witness to other crimes that are similar and just be a witness to them. Don't necessarily have to be partaking, and that also helps in desensitizing. But certainly, yes, it does appear that from nowhere, Mark Valera was able to walk into David Ahern's house and commit an absolutely horrendous crime without flinching.
No, and he says that it's essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but that it's a result of an extremely traumatic childhood.
Police the next day or two took him through the walkthrough, as you mentioned. And during all this time, there was no mention about him being abused, about him having suffered abuse, about him having felt that he needed to attack these people because of what had happened to him. None of that came out. That did not come out until basically when he started to appear in court. And that was then his defence. So you have to ask yourself, if that was the case, why didn't he mention it a lot earlier? There was opportunity. It wasn't like police were, quickly, tell us what you did. Okay, shut up now. They were like, okay, tell us what you did. Why'd you saw him, what happened? So there was plenty of opportunity for him to have told his story early.
In defence of his defence, though, we know that, many victims of childhood sexual abuse don't disclose for a very long time. He was clearly suffering psychological malaise, so perhaps it took a sympathetic defence team to help him understand the relationship between his past and his actions. I mean, I know, there's further sort of corroborating evidence down the road that we'll talk about, but oh God, I suppose I struggle to believe that he could have done it for no reason. I suppose that's the hard thing.
All right. Well, I mean, there are a lot of sadistic serial killers out there, but not all have been abused as a child. Certainly their childhoods are probably not ideal. Certainly nor was Valera's. I mean, Valera was in a situation where his mother had walked out when he was a very young child, both him and his sister, Belinda. He was brought up by his father, who was a builder, but of course was absent from the family a lot of the time because of his work. Had to leave early, come home late. He was in the care of very good friends of his father's. They looked after Valera for a very long time. They were his surrogate parents, and he blended into their family. At the same time, to make up for his absence, Jack spoiled the hell out of both Valera and his sister. Valera wanted to get into dirt trail bike riding. Other kids turned up with kind of secondhand gear, motley old bikes the dads had kind of got going for them, repairs with Band-Aids, that type of thing. Valera had brand new everything. Jack went out, bought him a brand new bike, brand new leathers, helmet, the lot, the gear, everything.
I seem to recall that Jack bought himself a bike as well so that they could do it together.
Correct, yeah. He was doing his best to be a dad, given, he wasn't always around and he had really no support other than these friends. And the mother had walked out, but then she turned up once Valera was arrested, and in court she turned up as the grieving mum, kind of inserted herself back into both Mark and Belinda's life.
How did it go down in the trial when he started talking about childhood abuse as perhaps a mitigating factor? As
far as the friends of Jack Van Krevel went, they were horrified because to them, they'd spent the majority of the kids' lives were with them. the friends, because Jack was always out working, earning money. So they were like puzzled, horrified, not unlike the O'Hearns. And in fact, the same reaction as the O'Hearns. Really devastated by what they're hearing and could not believe any of it. Admittedly, yes, okay, we can all say that the family and close friends are the first ones to, come to your defence. But at the same time, it was just they couldn't, physically they could not see how it could happen. And also the fact that, Mark seemed to be quite doting on his dad when he was a lot younger. Belinda, certainly, she was very much daddy's girl.
And Belinda was still living with her dad, wasn't she?
Belinda and Mark lived with their father the whole time as children.
And as adults, though, Belinda was an adult by this stage.
As adults, she still remained with her dad. In fact, she became pregnant and had a child, and Dad took her in.
Well, with the allegations as part of the whole trial, Mark Valera still was convicted of the 2 murders, and in fact is one of the few people in New South Wales history, Australian history, who have been imprisoned for a life sentence without parole. In fact, he was the 3rd youngest, I think, who's ever been sentenced to life without parole.
If you'd like to talk to someone about abuse that's taken place in your life, no matter how long ago it happened, your GP is always a good place to start. If that's not going to work for you, you can contact 1800-RESPECT on 1800-737-732 or via their website 1800respect.org.au. Or you can call Lifeline's 24-hour phone counselling service on 13 11 14.
Did Belinda support his claims during the trial that he'd been molested by his dad in childhood? What was the dynamic going on there at that time?
Belinda did believe her brother, irrespective, although she didn't have any memory of anything that may have happened.
Okay.
She admitted to that later, but she did believe that Mark was telling the truth.
While the jury didn't buy it, for Belinda, suddenly everything made sense.
I know what happened. Why would a 19-year-old boy, get up in front of the whole world and say that his father had raped him every day of his life if it's not true? So he can, make a fool of himself and embarrass himself? No 19-year-old boy is going to say that.
He was facing life in prison. His defence team had to come up with something to diminish his responsibility.
No.
Is it possible you've convinced yourself of this because you don't want to accept that he's a psychopath?
No, I don't need to
convince myself. That he's a serial killer?
No.
I can understand why you want to believe him. He's your brother.
It's not about understanding him to believe him. It happened.
Likewise, Mark's best friend and Belinda's former boyfriend, Mark Shriber, also believed without doubt that what Mark Valera was saying was totally true. And in that instance, Belinda was still at school, in fact, when she asked just out loud, would anyone like to kill my father? Mark Shriber, being Mark Valera's good friend and believing the whole story and being Belinda's ex-boyfriend, decided, yes, I'll do the job. But apparently he didn't tell Belinda this directly, but he turned up one night, grabbed a knife from the kitchen, walked into Jack's bedroom and stabbed him to death.
I mean, clearly it would have taken the police long to realise that whomever committed this crime knew the layout of the house pretty well, right? Because he knew where the weapons were located around the house. He also grabbed a tomahawk from the back shed, grabbed a bucket from behind the house to climb up through a window.
Yes.
The offender clearly knew his way around the house.
Of course he did. And in fact, it took police all of 5 minutes to work out that it was Shriber.
I find it hard to believe that Belinda didn't know what was going to happen because Shriber came into the house through Belinda's daughter's bedroom, but that night the daughter was in another bedroom with Belinda.
She was with Belinda, yes.
The window was left open. It seems very much like they'd worked this plan out together.
Yes, that's certainly what it looks like. But police were only able to prove that Mark did it himself. There was no evidence to show any direct collusion between Mark Shriber and Belinda, which is why Belinda was eventually charged with soliciting to murder and not murder. Police could never prove whether she knew if anyone actually would. Like, she didn't know any particular person.
She didn't know that someone had taken up the job.
Correct, yeah. And also, again, police could not prove that Belinda knew Mark's intentions, Mark Shriber's intentions, that he would be around at the house on that day, that he would find all the implements, that he would commit the murder and then leave.
She and her toddler daughter heard the attack, certainly, didn't they? I mean, Jack didn't go down easily. He really fought for his life.
Yeah, well, Jack was a big guy. He was bigger than Mark Shriber, and obviously being a builder, he was pretty solid. But I mean, the whole thing was because it was a total act of surprise. Now, Jack Van Krevel was asleep. He was in a deep sleep. And certainly Mark, was able to commence the assault well before Jack could come to consciousness. And by that time, he was probably, not in a fit state to really fight back in any proper way. She took herself to the police station and she, in a kind of a frantic way, said that something horrible's happened at her house. Her dad's been killed, I believe. And, just tried to get in there. Now, what happened was the police went around there, found Jack's body, and the beginnings of the investigation began. Joe Casa, who was involved with the apprehension of Mark Valera, along with Russell Oxford, who was also involved, got the call from Wollongong to say Jack Van Krevel's been killed, you better come down. And when Russell was talking to Joe over the phone, they both agreed immediately that it had to be Mark Shriber because of the fact that, Shriber was in court. In fact, I think he may have even been asked to leave at one point because he was being obnoxious in court when Valera was giving his defence. And they both agreed that it had to be Mark Shriber. So calls went out to try and find Mark. Mark was eventually found at a train station near Wollongong, was apprehended there. I believe he still had the blood-stained shirt that he was wearing and admitted to it straight away, what he'd done and why he'd done it, because he believed that Mark had been abused by his dad and Mark wouldn't be in prison if it wasn't for his dad. So, his dad needed to die.
I told him, this is for Mark, pedophile bastard. You'll never molest another kid again.
He made no contest. Not even an exception to the contest. Like with Mark Valera, the reason he went to trial was because he had a defence. So he was arguing, yes, I did all this. Yes, I admitted to doing all this, but it was for this reason. Whereas Schreiber's like, nah, I did it. Simple.
I just did it.
Yep, I just did it. And, I'm a bad guy and you can put me away. So it went straight pretty much to sentencing. There's no reason for a trial. He never said anything about, as far as I'm aware, never said anything about Belinda asking for it to happen, but certainly said he did it for Mark.
And there's no suggestion that any money changed hands or anything like that, which is usually the case when someone's soliciting for a murder.
Belinda did offer money because she knew she would get an inheritance. And she also knew that her dad had a stash of cash under some floorboards in the living area.
Oh, so once he was dead, she would be able to pay.
She did, correct. And that was part of her incentive for people to commit the murder was that if you do it, I've got a stash of cash that you can have.
We should point out too that this happened, the murder of Jack Van Krevel happened, I think, less than 2 weeks after his son, Mark Valera, was sentenced to that life sentence.
It was very quick, yes.
So there's a lot of emotion, obviously, around his friends and his sister Belinda. And so Shriber has decided to take revenge as he saw it.
Correct.
Gosh.
Yeah.
Belinda van Krevel, the sister, the former girlfriend who's in the middle of this whole story.
Yeah.
She's a character, I'll say that. In fact, she says that when she went to the police station to report the attack that had happened at her house, she said that the police sort of didn't take her seriously until she gave her name, and then they realised who she was. So obviously the family was notorious around town by that stage. She ended up being sentenced to 6 years for soliciting a man to murder her father. Did she go to trial or did she plead guilty to that?
No, she went to trial.
Okay.
Yeah, she did go to trial because John Staton was trying to just defend her, to say that she didn't really intend to and everything else. And also the interview with Mark Shriber, this is the thing too, that police interview of Mark Shriber's was played at Belinda's trial because Shriber in that interview is doing his best to defend Belinda, to say that he didn't know whether she was serious or not, but he felt bad about Mark Valera and he felt, really angry towards Jack because, again, as I said, if it hadn't been for Jack, Mark wouldn't be in prison. That was his belief. So that's why he committed the murder.
So he was trying to say, look, I didn't do it because she wanted it done. I did it because I wanted it done.
He was taking it all on his shoulders. He was carrying the whole weight. And what was interesting was, even though that was played to the court as part of Belinda's defence, the judge didn't believe a word of what Shriber was saying. He felt that he was overplaying his part and that he was trying his best to deflect any guilt towards Belinda, and that's how she eventually was found to be guilty of soliciting.
And she copped 6 years for that. She did some time for that. I don't know if she did the full 6, but she's had a few brushes with the law since then. In 2023, Belinda pled guilty to stabbing her partner. I'll go back to the way we started this conversation when I asked you why this case, what fascinated you, and you were saying, that basically there's a human story here and there's so many human stories here. We have the Ahern families, we have the Arkell family, and of course we have the Van Krevel family. Well, once you put them all together, these families that probably never would have met under any other circumstances.
No, definitely not.
It is a complex and fascinating story.
It is indeed a complex story because not so much about what happened, but more because of the allegations that were made after everything had happened. That's what's complicated all of this. That's what's caused probably even more pain. It's definitely the salt in the wound situation. When I decided to write this book, I knew I couldn't write it without getting the help of the families. And my first stop were the O'Hearns, and the O'Hearns were very, very sceptical because they had been burnt so much by the media, where they'd been told, yes, you can tell your story, come sit down with us. And they sat down, and next you know, that whole thing's being twisted, and it's like, the big question still remains, was David O'Hearn in a part of a pedophile ring? Did he and Frank Arkell meet regularly?
When in fact there was no question from investigators, from anyone who knew either of them.
Exactly, yeah. But that doesn't make a good story.
Yeah.
Nothing was ever really said that said, yes, there is this thing going on. It was all... Is it? There's all this question mark, enough to get your interest if you want to read that kind of thing. And that's what the O'Hearns were suffering. So I actually went down there on a very wet, windy, awful day, went down and met them, and I met with the brothers and sisters and their spouses and sat down and, we spoke for a very long time, and they just needed to be sure that what I would say, whether they liked it or not, would be the truth. Not every member of the family was happy or even knew that David was homosexual and certainly weren't happy that it had come out. And they were still hurting a lot. I mean, one sister, just couldn't sleep. I mean, Wollongong isn't exactly, well, you would not think it is a crime mecca. And, there are, people who leave their front doors unlocked and have a very nice sleep and, don't fear anything. But this poor woman, was locking her door. She couldn't sleep at nights. The stress that happens to a family when a member of their family is murdered is just incredible.
Yeah, people talk about it as a loss of innocence, don't they? You wrote in your book, 80% of homicides are committed by a person known to the victim.
Correct.
It's so rare that a stranger commits a homicide, let alone a brutal one like this one.
Indeed.
So it must just shake up your understanding of the world around you forever when it's your brother.
And if you look at the profile of what a victim could be, David O'Hearn is not in that category.
No, he was not living a risky lifestyle at all.
Indeed. He was not working night shift. He was not,
partying. He wasn't
exactly.
Yeah.
He was not putting himself out there to be at any risk at all.
But even though it's not that long ago, and yet, as you say, the attitudes toward the gay brother in the family could still be really tense, really inhibitive, couldn't they? As you said, there were members of his family who still didn't know he was gay. One brother said, I just thought he was asexual. Obviously, it was not out and proud in any way because it was still difficult for people to be that way. You know, obviously it was very difficult for the family to meet with you, let alone give you permission to write the story. And
indeed. And
you wrote graphically about the crime committed against their family member, David.
Yes.
I believe in that personally because I've had victims' families say to me, they don't want it whitewashed. They don't want it cleaned up for public consumption. When something horrible happened to this member of their family, was committed by another human, they want people to know.
Correct. And the O'Hearns were very much like that. And I actually made sure that they were okay with it. Not all the members of the family read what I wrote, but some did, and those that did were okay with it. What happened, sadly. They appreciated that I'd also put in David's history in there. The fact of his, time in Wollongong, time in Tasmania, coming back, his closeness with his mum, all of that was in there as well. It wasn't just, a victim and a name to a victim. It was a person, a real person. And with the Van Krevels, obviously, I couldn't talk to any of the family members there, but I did talk to the friends who looked after the kids. And again, same situation there. They were happy for me to tell the story, but, we're concerned that I didn't exaggerate or, anyway. But, and again, they were very helpful in giving me a good background on the two kids.
Because without their input, it would have been a very one-sided story.
Indeed. The only family who didn't participate were the Arkells.
Yeah. Well, they had a lot of issues going on.
Correct. They did. A member of the family did actually reach out after I'd made contact and said to me that they weren't prepared to help me, but at the same time they weren't going to stop me, and that they were happy with, kind of for me to go ahead and do it, but they were concerned that I wasn't going to glorify what had happened and everything else. And when I'd written what I'd written, obviously I couldn't give it to anyone to read because they didn't want to know about it. But what the Illawarra Mercury did, they printed an extract from my book, and it just happened to be the graphic murder of Frank Arkell.
Well, of course. He was the most high-profile victim.
Of course.
Yeah.
And they just happened to print the murder, which was really lovely. Thanks, guys. And not long after it was published, I got a phone call from an irate friend of Frank Arkell's. Understandably. Total understandable. And he called me and spent about 10 minutes venting about the piece in the paper. And once he had exhausted his vent, I sat down and explained to him about the rest of the book and what I'd written about Frank.
In context, it was very even-handed. And again, as you did with Ahern, you went to great lengths to talk about Frank the person.
Correct.
His achievements, all of those things to make him a three-dimensional person.
Yeah, I mean, and a lot had been written about Frank Arkell. A lot.
Well, thank you so much. It's a great book, Bound by Blood. It's a story that I couldn't find. Once I realised there was this whole side story to the Frank Arkell murder, of course I went looking everywhere and I struggled to find a lot of detail until I found your book. So I know it was published in 2004, I believe. Well, no one's bettered it, mate, I can tell you that, because it's thoroughly researched and very humane telling of this story about people who all describe themselves as normal. That's another fascinating aspect of your book is just that, everyone says, we're just a normal family. How could this happen to us? Everybody considers themselves that way.
Exactly. You're not wrong.
Thank you to our guest today, John Suter Linton. If you need support after listening to this podcast, you can call Lifeline on 13 11 14 or contact 1-800-RESPECT on 1-800-737 732 or 1800respect.org.au. Indigenous Australians can contact 13 Yarn on 13 92 76 or 13yarn.org.au.
The producers of this podcast recognise the traditional owners of the land on which it's recorded. They pay respect to the Aboriginal elders past, present and those emerging.